June 17, 2017, 7:30 p.m. Austin, Texas. Natalie, 38 years old, CEO of an education technology startup worth $18 million, sent her last message on a dating app. 5 words and a heart emoji. Arriving in 5 minutes. Can't wait. She pulled into the parking lot of Josephine House, a farm-to-table restaurant in central Austin, where exposed brick walls and string lights created the kind of atmosphere that made first dates feel like something more. Surveillance cameras captured her Tesla Model 3 entering at 7:27 p.m. They captured her walking through the front door 2 minutes later, wearing a blue dress she'd changed into specifically for this moment. They captured her sitting at a table for 2, checking her phone, smiling at something on the screen. They captured 40 minutes of waiting. But here's what they never captured. Natalie leaving. Not through the front door, not through the back. Not through any exit in the building. Her car stayed in that parking lot for 9 days. Her bank accounts, holding $4.2 million, were never touched again. 7 years later, the truth revealed something worse than anyone imagined. Something systematic. Something that had been happening all along. Natalie built her company in 2012, started in a garage, grew to 43 employees, secured funding from venture capital firms that saw the future she was selling. Educational software that made learning accessible. She earned $240,000 annually, plus equity worth $4.2 million. She owned a house in Westlake Hills valued at $1.8 million. She drove a Tesla because she believed in sustainability. She recycled. She voted. She volunteered at her daughter's school when her schedule allowed. Normal life. Successful life. The kind of life people post about on LinkedIn with humble brag captions about gratitude and hard work. 8 months before she disappeared, Natalie finalized her divorce from Marcus. 9 years of marriage dissolved in family court. He walked away with $850,000 from their joint savings. She kept the company. That was the deal. Clean split. Their daughter, Sophie, 6 years old, would live primarily with Marcus in the house they used to share. Natalie saw her daughter on weekends and Wednesday evenings. The divorce was civil. They didn't fight in front of Sophie. They didn't weaponize custody. They were adults about it, the way divorced parents are supposed to be but rarely are. But Natalie was lonely. That's what she told her older sister Elena, a homicide detective in Houston. Elena remembered that phone call weeks before the disappearance. Natalie's voice had this quality to it, like she was asking permission to be happy again. "I miss having someone," Natalie had said. "I miss feeling wanted." Elena told her sister what sisters are supposed to say. "You'll find someone when you're ready. Don't rush it. Make sure they're worth your time." All the protective older sister advice that sounds good but doesn't actually prepare anyone for what comes next. There was something else about Natalie that mattered, something small that became significant later. She always wore an Apple Watch. Always. The GPS tracked her runs, her drives, her daily movements. Health data, location data, the digital footprint of a woman who lived in 2017. But on June 17th, when she left her house for the restaurant, she left the watch on her bathroom counter. Charging. She never explained why. Maybe the band didn't match her dress. Maybe the battery was low. Maybe she just forgot. Or maybe something else. Some unconscious instinct that told her not to be tracked that night. 3 weeks before she disappeared, Natalie met someone online. His name was Blake. At least that's what his profile said. The dating app was called Hinge. Natalie had downloaded it 4 months after the divorce papers were signed, on a night when Sophie was at Marcus's house and the silence in her Westlake home felt too heavy. She wasn't looking for anything serious. That's what she told herself. Just conversations. Just the possibility of feeling like someone saw her again. Blake's profile appeared on her screen on a Thursday evening in late May. 40 years old, divorced, no children. An architect, according to his bio. Photos showed him at outdoor concerts, hiking trails, European cities that looked expensive. His face was handsome in that approachable way, not model perfect but warm. Real. The kind of face you could trust. His opening message wasn't generic. He'd read her profile, noticed she mentioned educational reform, and asked a thoughtful question about charter schools versus public funding. They messaged for 3 days before he suggested moving to text. They texted for 2 weeks before he asked if she wanted to meet in person. "I know a place," he wrote, "Josephine House in Central Austin. Farm to table, intimate, perfect for actually talking without screaming over music. Does Saturday work?" Natalie said yes. She told her friend Ivy about the date. Ivy, her business partner, the woman who owned 20% of the company they'd built together, raised an eyebrow over coffee. "He seems too good to be true," Ivy said. "That's what worries me." But Natalie smiled, the kind of smile that happens when someone's already decided to hope. "After Marcus," she replied, "I deserve something good." Trio. What Natalie didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Blake had been watching her digital footprint for weeks before that first message. He knew about the divorce settlement because court documents are public record. He knew about her company's valuation because tech blogs covered Series B funding rounds. He knew she'd recently sold 15% of her equity for $2.7 million because she'd mentioned it casually in a LinkedIn post about growth and gratitude. Blake wasn't his real name. The photos weren't his face. The architect's story wasn't his life. But the attention he gave her, the way he seemed to understand her loneliness, the emotional intimacy he built through carefully crafted messages, that was real. That was the trap. And it worked every time. June 17th arrived. Natalie spent the morning in a board meeting, animated about new investor interest. She called Elena that afternoon, her voice carrying that nervous energy that comes before first dates. "I'm finally meeting him tonight," she told her sister. "I think this could be something." Elena, who'd been a detective long enough to be suspicious of everything, asked the standard questions. "Have you video chatted? Does anyone else know where you're going? Text me when you get there." Natalie laughed, said her sister watched too many crime shows, promised she'd check in. At 6:45 p.m. she arrived home from the office. She changed out of her work clothes into the blue dress. She checked her reflection 3 times. At 7:10 p.m. she backed her Tesla out of the driveway. At 7:27 p.m. surveillance cameras at Josephine House captured her arrival. She parked near the entrance, walked in alone, looked around for someone who wasn't there yet. A hostess seated her at a table for 2 near the windows. Natalie ordered water, declined the wine list, said she was waiting for someone. She checked her phone every few minutes. At 8:11 p.m. she stood up. Security footage shows her walking toward the back of the restaurant, toward the restrooms maybe, or the rear exit, and then nothing. The cameras that should have captured the parking lot, the alley behind the building, every possible route she could have taken, they showed no one matching her description. No blue dress. No woman leaving alone or with anyone else. She simply vanished in the space between one camera angle and the next. June 18th, 10:30 a.m. Marcus called Elena's cell phone. His voice had an edge to it, the kind of worry that doesn't waste time on pleasantries. "Natalie didn't pick up Sophie from school yesterday," he said. "She's not answering her phone. Her assistant says she didn't show up for work this morning. Something's wrong." Elena drove to Natalie's house in Westlake, her detective instincts already cataloging possibilities. Front door locked, no signs of forced entry. Natalie's purse wasn't inside, neither was her phone. But her Apple Watch sat on the bathroom counter, still plugged into the charger, screen dark. Elena checked the garage. Empty. She called Austin PD, gave them the Tesla's license plate, started making the kind of calls that turn a missing person into an active investigation. At 12:45 p.m., a patrol officer found Natalie's car in the parking lot of Josephine House, 9 hours after she'd supposedly left. The Tesla was locked, undisturbed, exactly where she'd parked it the night before. Elena arrived 20 minutes later, walked into the restaurant, asked to speak with the manager. The woman, mid-30s with worry lines forming on her forehead, pulled up the security footage. She came in around 7:30, the manager explained, scrolling through the video. Waited at the table for maybe 40 minutes, then she walked toward the back. She fast-forwarded, pointed at the timestamp. 8:11 p.m. That's the last we see of her inside. Elena leaned closer to the screen. Show me the exterior cameras. The manager switched views, showed footage from the parking lot, the street, the alley behind the building. Nothing. No woman in a blue dress. No one leaving the restaurant during that time window. That's impossible, Elena said quietly. But impossible or not, Natalie was gone. Austin Police Department opened a missing persons case at 2:30 p.m. on June 18th. Within 48 hours, they'd pulled Natalie's phone records, banking activity, social media accounts, everything that leaves a digital trail in the modern world. Her last text message had been sent at 7:27 p.m. on the 17th. That final arriving in 5 minutes to Blake through the Hinge app. Her phone's location services showed it powering down at 7:45 p.m., just 14 minutes after she'd sent that message. No calls made. No texts sent after that. The bank accounts holding $4.2 million showed zero activity. No withdrawals, no transfers, nothing. The woman had simply stopped existing in the digital world at the exact moment she vanished from the physical one. Detective Chen from Austin PD ran a search for Blake's profile on Hinge. What he found made the case infinitely more complicated. The account had been deleted at 7:50 p.m. on June 17th. Whoever Blake was, he'd erased himself from the platform within an hour of Natalie's disappearance. The phone number linked to the account traced back to a burner phone purchased with cash at a convenience store in Dallas 3 weeks earlier. The email address used to create the profile belonged to a temporary account hosted on a server in the Czech Republic, already deactivated. Even the photos, when Chen ran them through reverse image search, turned out to be stolen from an Italian photographer's Instagram account. Blake didn't exist. He never had. Marcus became the first suspect because husbands and ex-husbands always are. The statistics don't lie. When a woman disappears, start with the intimate partner. Elena knew this, hated knowing it, but couldn't argue with the logic. Marcus had motive written all over him. $850,000 in a divorce settlement sounds substantial until you realize your ex-wife kept a company worth millions. He'd hired a lawyer 2 days before Natalie disappeared, asking about options to renegotiate the divorce agreement. The timing looked damning, but his alibi held up under scrutiny. On the night of June 17th, Marcus had been home with Sophie, and their babysitter confirmed it. The young woman, a college student from UT Austin, had arrived at 6 p.m. and stayed until 10:30 p.m. because Marcus had to work late, making calls to clients on the West Coast from his home office. Phone records confirmed those calls. Security footage from his gated community showed his car never leaving the driveway. Marcus was cooperative, almost excessively so. He volunteered information before investigators asked. He offered access to his laptop, his phone, his financial records. He took a polygraph and passed. He cried during the interview, real tears that detectives who'd seen plenty of fake ones believed were genuine. But something about his eagerness bothered Elena. People who have nothing to hide don't usually work this hard to prove it. She couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus knew something, even if he wasn't directly involved. But feelings don't hold up in court, and the evidence cleared him. Ivy presented a different kind of problem. She and Natalie had been friends before they became business partners, which meant their relationship carried the weight of both affection and money, two things that ruin relationships faster than anything else. Ivy owned 20% of the company, a stake worth approximately $3.6 million based on the most recent valuation. But she'd been pushing for a larger share, arguing that her contributions to product development and investor relations justified it. Email records uncovered during the investigation revealed something uncomfortable. 1 week before Natalie disappeared, Ivy had written to a corporate attorney asking about legal options for removing a majority shareholder who's making unilateral decisions that harm company growth. The lawyer's response laid out a path that required proving either incompetence or breach of fiduciary duty, neither of which applied to Natalie. Ivy's alibi for the night of June 17th was solid, but not airtight. She'd been at dinner with potential investors at Uchi, a sushi restaurant in South Austin. Credit card receipts confirmed the reservation. 3 people corroborated her presence. But the dinner ended at 9:15 p.m., and Uchi was only a 12-minute drive from Josephine House. The timing gave her a window, technically. When investigators asked if she'd submit to a polygraph, Ivy refused. "I know my rights," she said. "And I know you're trying to build a case where there isn't one. Natalie was my friend. I would never hurt her." The defensiveness felt wrong to Elena, but defensiveness isn't evidence. Ivy hired an attorney, stopped cooperating, and the investigation stalled. The ghost they called Blake became the primary suspect by default, though tracking a ghost proved impossible. FBI got involved because the digital elements crossed state lines. The burner phone had been purchased in Dallas. The email server was international. The stolen photos originated in Europe. Special Agent Trevor Marsh, a cybercrime specialist, took over that angle of the investigation. What he found was a pattern, but a pattern so subtle it had never been flagged before. The Hinge account that contacted Natalie had been active for only 28 days before being deleted. In that time, it had initiated conversations with 12 other women in Austin, Houston, and Dallas. All of them were professional women in their 30s and 40s. All of them were divorced or recently single. And all of them had mentioned, at some point in their conversations with Blake, their financial situations. One woman, a dentist in Houston, told investigators that Blake had seemed almost too interested in her new clinic, asking detailed questions about startup costs and revenue projections. Another woman, a lawyer in Dallas, remembered Blake asking about her caseload and hourly rate, framing it as admiration for successful women. The conversations felt natural in the moment. Only in retrospect did they reveal themselves as intelligence gathering. But none of those 12 women had agreed to meet Blake in person. They'd all gotten busy or cautious or simply ghosted him the way online dating encourages people to do. Natalie was the only one who'd said yes to the dinner. She was the only one who showed up. Elena took a leave of absence from her job in Houston 3 weeks after her sister disappeared. She couldn't work homicides when her own sister's case consumed every waking thought. She moved temporarily to Austin, rented a small apartment near downtown, and turned one wall of the living room into an investigation board. Photos of Natalie, timelines, maps, everything the official investigation had, and everything they'd missed. She reviewed 847 hours of CCTV footage from cameras within a 6-block radius of Josephine House, watching until her eyes burned, looking for anything the Austin PD had overlooked. And she found something. At 8:11 p.m., the exact time Natalie disappeared from the restaurant's interior cameras, a woman in a blue dress appeared on a street camera 2 blocks away. The footage was grainy. The angle was bad, but the dress matched. The woman walked quickly, not running but not casual either, and approached a white van parked on a side street. The van's rear doors opened. The woman got in, or was pulled in. The footage quality made it impossible to tell. The van drove away heading north on Lamar Boulevard. Elena ran the license plate. It came back registered to a catering company that had gone out of business 3 years earlier. The company's owner had died in 2015. The van had been reported stolen in 2016 but never recovered. It was a ghost vehicle, just like Blake was a ghost person. Everything about this case dissolved into nothing when you tried to grab it. Elena brought her findings to Detective Chen. He assigned 2 officers to track the van through traffic cameras, following its route north through Austin and out toward the interstate. They tracked it for 43 miles before losing it in a gap between camera coverage near Round Rock. The van simply disappeared into the Texas night, carrying Natalie or whoever that woman in the blue dress had been. 3 months passed, then 6. The case went cold not because investigators stopped caring, but because there was nowhere left to look. Every lead ended in a deleted account, a fake name, a stolen identity. Marcus was granted full custody of Sophie through a family court proceeding that felt more like a funeral than a legal matter. Ivy, no longer under suspicion, sold the company for $12.5 million, well below market value but enough to satisfy the investors who wanted out. The money was divided according to ownership percentages, with Natalie's share placed in a trust for Sophie. Natalie's bank accounts remained untouched, $4.2 million frozen in time, waiting for an owner who would never come back to claim them. At the 6-month mark, Austin PD officially reclassified the case. Not closed, but archived. The file stayed open technically, but no one was actively working it. They called it a voluntary disappearance, which was police speak for, "We have no idea what happened, and we're giving up." Elena refused to accept that designation. She couldn't, because she knew her sister. Natalie wouldn't have walked away from Sophie. Not for any amount of money. Not for any reason that made sense. Something had happened that night at Josephine House, something violent and planned. And the person who'd called himself Blake had made it look like magic. 7 years is long enough for a case to fade from public memory, but not long enough for a sister to stop searching. By March of 2024, Elena was 51 years old, with gray threading through her dark hair and lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before Natalie disappeared. She'd returned to her detective job in Houston after that first year, but something fundamental had broken in her. The obsession with her sister's case had cost her marriage, her career advancement, everything she'd built before June 17th. 2017 became the date that divided her life into before and after. She worked missing persons now instead of homicides, a lateral move that felt like demotion, but gave her access to databases and resources she needed. Her apartment in Houston had one wall dedicated to what everyone called her conspiracy board, though Elena knew it wasn't conspiracy when the pattern was real. 47 printed profiles of suspicious online dating accounts, all operating in Texas between 2015 and 2023. 12 cases of missing women, professional women, divorced or recently single, ages 35 to 45. All of them had mentioned money in their last known communications. All of them had vanished after agreeing to first dates at upscale restaurants. Austin, Houston, Dallas, San Antonio. The 4 cities formed a geographic cluster that couldn't be coincidence. Sophie was 13 now, a teenager who barely remembered her mother. Marcus had remarried 2 years after Natalie's disappearance, and Sophie called her stepmother Mom, because that's who'd been there for dance recitals and middle school orientation, and all the small moments that build a childhood. Elena saw her niece occasionally, awkward visits, where they both pretended the absence between them wasn't shaped exactly like Natalie. The girl had her mother's eyes, but Marcus's reserved temperament, and she'd stopped asking about the investigation years ago. Some losses are too big to carry, so children learn to set them down and walk away. Adults don't have that luxury. Elena carried her sister with her everywhere, a weight that never lightened. March 14th, 2024. A hunter named Dale Hoffman was tracking deer on a private property in Bastrop County, about 45 minutes southeast of Austin. The land was 80 acres of scrub brush and cedar, owned by some LLC registered in the Cayman Islands and left to grow wild for years. Hoffman had permission to hunt there from whoever managed the property remotely, and he'd been walking the fence line looking for signs of wildlife when he noticed something wrong with the ground. A depression in the soil that looked too regular, too deliberate. He'd been hunting long enough to know the difference between natural erosion and something else. He called the sheriff's office at 3:15 p.m. By 4:30, deputies had secured the scene. By 6 p.m., they'd brought in ground-penetrating radar. By 8 p.m., they knew they had multiple graves. The first body was exhumed on March 15th. Forensic anthropologists worked carefully, documenting everything, treating the remains with the dignity the living hadn't afforded them. Dental records identified the victim within 72 hours. Natalie Mitchell, 38 years old when she disappeared, 7 years in the ground. Elena got the call on March 18th. She was at her desk in Houston, working through a stack of missing persons reports, when her phone rang with an Austin area code. The medical examiner's voice was professional, careful, the tone people use when they're about to deliver information that can't be taken back. "We've found your sister," the voice said. "I'm very sorry." The forensic team expanded their search across the entire 80-acre property. What they found turned a tragedy into something much worse. Between March 15th and March 22nd, they recovered 12 bodies total. All women. All between the ages of 35 and 48. All had been in the ground between 1 and 8 years. The graves were arranged in a pattern, almost geometric in their precision, as if whoever buried them had been following some internal map. There was no evidence of sexual assault. The cause of death, according to preliminary examinations, was asphyxiation in each case. They'd been suffocated, probably with something soft that left no marks, probably while they were unconscious. Each body had been buried with something personal. Jewelry, a wallet, a cell phone. Items that would have made identification easier if anyone had found them sooner, which raised questions about the killer's psychology. Did he want them identified eventually? Was this pride in his work, or something else? The FBI took jurisdiction on March 23rd. Special Agent Trevor Marsh, the same cybercrime specialist who'd worked Natalie's case 7 years earlier, flew to Austin to lead the task force. He was older now, grayer, but his memory was sharp. He'd never stopped thinking about that ghost named Blake, who'd vanished into the digital ether. Now he had 12 more victims to compare against Natalie's disappearance, 12 more data points to find the pattern. The Bureau assigned 16 agents to the case. They worked out of a command center in downtown Austin, walls covered with photos and timelines, and the kind of information that looks like chaos until it suddenly resolves into something clear. By the end of March, they'd identified all 13 victims and begun mapping their lives backward, looking for the intersection point where a predator had found them. The victims were Diana, a plastic surgeon from Houston who disappeared in 2016. Rebecca, a corporate attorney from Dallas who vanished in late 2017. Samantha, who owned an art gallery in San Antonio and went missing in 2018. Julia, a CFO of a tech startup in Austin, gone in 2019. Monica, a dentist who owned 3 clinics in Houston, disappeared in 2020. Veronica, a luxury real estate broker from Dallas, missing since late 2020. Alicia, a pharmaceutical executive from Austin, vanished in 2021. Cassandra, an architect from San Antonio, gone in 2022. Brooke, who owned a veterinary clinic in Houston, disappeared mid-2022. Paige, a financial consultant from Dallas, missing since early 2023. Kendall, an interior designer from Austin, gone mid-2023. and Lauren, a senior software engineer from Houston, the most recent victim, disappeared in late 2023. 13 women, 13 successful professionals, 13 bank accounts that collectively held more than $40 million before their owners vanished. The FBI's digital forensics team started with what they knew about Blake from Natalie's case and expanded outward, searching through archived data from dating apps, social media platforms, email providers. What they found was staggering in its scope: 47 different online identities, 47 different faces stolen from strangers, 47 different names that all followed the same pattern: common American first names that didn't stand out. Blake, Ryan, Chase, Carter, Jason, Derek, Tyler, names that could belong to anyone. The profiles had been created and deleted in cycles, never staying active longer than 6 weeks. Each profile targeted a specific city, a specific type of woman. The conversations all followed similar patterns once the forensic linguists analyzed them. Phrases repeated across different accounts, different victims. You deserve to be valued. I understand what you've been through. We can take this as slowly as you need. Empathy weaponized. Understanding used as bait. The artificial intelligence programs that analyzed the message archives found something else, something the human investigators had missed. The timing of the messages suggested one person behind all 47 accounts, typing at consistent speeds, responding at similar intervals, working during specific hours that matched someone with a day job. This wasn't a full-time predator. This was someone who hunted in his spare time. The breakthrough in understanding how he'd done it came from Lauren's cell phone. She'd been the last victim, disappeared in late 2023, and her body had been the most recently buried, which meant organic decay hadn't destroyed everything yet. The phone had been sealed in a plastic bag and buried with her, and while water damage had corrupted most of the device, the FBI's technical team managed to extract fragments of data from the memory chip. What they found changed everything investigators thought they knew about the case. There was an application installed on Lauren's phone that she hadn't downloaded herself, a remote access program typically used by IT departments to troubleshoot computers. The installation timestamp was 11:17 p.m. on the night she disappeared, roughly 2 hours after her last known location at a restaurant in Houston. The app had been active for 72 hours after installation, sending and receiving data, accessing her banking applications, her email, her social media. Someone had been controlling her phone remotely. Someone had been impersonating her digitally while her body was already buried in Bastrop County. Agent Marsh brought in a forensic accountant named Patricia Chen, a woman who'd spent 20 years tracking financial crimes for the Treasury Department before joining the FBI. Chen's job was to follow the money backward from 13 empty bank accounts to wherever $42 million had disappeared to over 8 years. What she uncovered was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. Every victim had made electronic transfers from their accounts within 24 to 72 hours after they disappeared. Not large transfers that would trigger automatic reporting requirements, but multiple smaller ones. $9,900. Just below the $10,000 threshold that banks are legally required to report to the federal government. The transfers went to different accounts, dozens of them, scattered across 23 countries. Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Singapore, Panama, Liechtenstein, places where banking privacy laws protected account holders from foreign law enforcement. The IP addresses associated with the transfers traced back to public Wi-Fi networks, coffee shops, public libraries, airport terminals, places where anyone could sit with a laptop for an hour without drawing attention. But here was the thing that made Chen's hands shake when she presented her findings to the task force. The victims hadn't made those transfers under duress after being kidnapped. They'd made them while already dead, or more accurately, Someone had made the transfers using their legitimate credentials, their passwords, their security questions, their biometric data. The question that haunted everyone was simple and impossible. How do you get a woman to give you complete access to her financial life and then kill her before she realizes what she's done? The answer came from toxicology reports on the remains. Despite decomposition, the forensic pathologists found trace evidence in bone marrow, in teeth, in the parts of the body that preserve chemical signatures long after soft tissue is gone. Flunitrazepam. The generic name for what most people call roofies, the date rape drug that erases memory and compliance into the same chemical package. But the concentrations they found suggested something more than a single dose slipped into a drink. These women had been heavily sedated, kept in a twilight state between consciousness and unconsciousness, aware enough to respond to simple commands but too impaired to resist or remember. In that state, a person will answer questions. They'll unlock their phones when asked. They'll repeat passwords out loud. They'll place their thumb on a fingerprint scanner. They'll do whatever a calm voice tells them to do because the drug destroys the part of the brain that says no. And then, when they're no longer useful, when every account has been accessed and every security measure has been bypassed, they're suffocated quietly. No violence, no struggle. Just a pillow pressed over a face until breathing stops. Clinical. Efficient. Monstrous in its calculation. Elena sat in the FBI command center on April 2nd, surrounded by agents and evidence boxes and the accumulated horror of 8 years of systematic murder, and felt something break inside her that had been holding together through sheer force of will. Her sister had died confused and chemically helpless, her autonomy stripped away, her intelligence and success turned into targeting criteria. Natalie had been chosen specifically because she was smart and successful and financially stable. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd built, had made her prey. The cruelty of that logic was almost too much to comprehend. Agent Marsh put a hand on Elena's shoulder, not saying anything because there was nothing to say that would make this better. "We're going to find him," Marsh said eventually. "The money leaves a trail. The property leaves a trail. Someone owns that land. Someone buried 13 bodies with enough arrogance to arrange them in a pattern. That kind of arrogance always leads to mistakes." Elena looked at the map on the wall. The 80 acres in Bastrop County marked with pins showing where each body had been found. The pattern did look deliberate, almost artistic. A spiral moving outward from a central point. Whoever had done this had spent years building his gallery of victims, and he'd wanted them found eventually. The question was why? Pride? Compulsion? Or something darker? Some need to be recognized for what he'd accomplished. 3 days later, they had their answer. The property in Bastrop County was owned by an LLC called Bluestone Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands but managed through a law firm in Dallas. The law firm, when served with a federal subpoena, provided documentation showing that Bluestone Holdings was actually a subsidiary of another company, which was owned by a third entity, a shell game of corporate structures designed to obscure the ultimate owner. But money always flows somewhere real eventually, and the FBI's forensic accountants traced it through 6 layers of legal fiction until they found a name: Brandon Mitchell, 42 years old. A cybersecurity specialist who'd worked for 3 of the largest banks in Texas over the past decade. A man with expert knowledge of financial systems, security protocols, digital privacy, and how to move money invisibly through the global banking network. And here was the detail that made Elena's blood go cold when Marsh showed her the file. Brandon Mitchell was Marcus's second cousin. They'd grown up in the same extended family. They'd attended the same family reunions. They knew each other. The connection between Brandon Mitchell and Marcus wasn't close enough to show up in routine background checks, which is why no one had looked at him 7 years earlier when Natalie first disappeared. Second cousins don't typically rate investigation unless there's clear motive or opportunity. But Marcus remembered Brandon from family gatherings, the occasional wedding or funeral that brought the extended Mitchell clan together. He remembered Brandon as quiet, professional, the kind of relative who showed up alone to these events and left early, always polite, but never quite part of the conversation. When the FBI showed Marcus a photo of Brandon and asked if he recognized him, Marcus went pale. "That's Brandon," he said. "We're not close. I haven't seen him in years." "Maybe since 2016? The agents asked Marcus to think carefully about that last interaction, to remember what they'd talked about, because sometimes the smallest detail unlocks everything. Marcus closed his eyes, mentally sorting through years of forgettable family events, until he landed on something specific: a barbecue at his aunt's house in Dallas. Summer of 2016. He and Natalie had been in the early stages of their divorce, the part where everything was still civil but the end was inevitable. He'd gone to the barbecue alone because Natalie had Sophie that weekend. Brandon had been there, and they'd ended up talking while Marcus nursed a beer in the backyard. Just small talk, catching up the way distant relatives do. Marcus had mentioned the divorce, mentioned that Natalie's company was doing well, mentioned something about how she was going to end up with most of the money because she'd built the business before they got married. He didn't remember Brandon saying much in response, just nodding, asking a few polite questions about how Marcus was handling it. The conversation couldn't have lasted more than 10 minutes, but it had been enough. It had planted the seed. Brandon Mitchell had spent 15 years building expertise that made him invisible and dangerous in equal measure. He'd started his career at a regional bank in Houston, working in their cybersecurity division, learning how financial institutions protected customer data, and more importantly, how those protections could be bypassed by someone with administrative access. He moved to a larger bank in Dallas in 2013, then to one of the biggest banks in Texas in 2017, each position giving him deeper knowledge of security protocols, fraud detection systems, and the regulatory blind spots that existed in the space between different institutions. He understood how money moved, how it could be moved quietly, and how to make transfers look legitimate enough that no automated system would flag them. He was good at his job, received positive performance reviews, showed up on time, never drew attention to himself. His coworkers would later describe him as professional but distant, the kind of person who didn't join them for happy-hour drinks but never refused to help with a technical problem. He lived alone in a modest apartment in San Antonio, drove a Toyota Camry that was 5 years old, dressed in business casual from Target. Nothing about his life suggested wealth or extravagance. Nothing suggested that he'd stolen $42 million over 8 years. The FBI's geographic profiling had pointed them toward San Antonio before they even knew Brandon's name. 10 of the 13 victims had disappeared from restaurants that formed a loose circle around the city, with San Antonio at the center. The property in Bastrop County was 90 minutes northeast. Brandon's employment history showed he'd lived in San Antonio since 2018, but before that he'd bounced between Houston, Dallas, and Austin, following job opportunities, always staying just long enough to establish himself before moving on. The pattern fit perfectly. He'd hunted in cities where he had professional connections, where he knew the geography, where he could blend into the background. And he'd buried his victims in a place he controlled absolutely, a piece of land purchased through corporate shells so complex that tracing ownership had taken federal prosecutors weeks. On March 27, 2024, at 5:30 in the morning, 16 FBI agents executed a no-knock warrant on Brandon's apartment. It was a small one-bedroom unit in a complex near the medical center, the kind of place where neighbors don't know each other's names and no one questions someone coming home late at night. They breached the door while Brandon was awake, sitting at his desk in the darkness, illuminated only by the glow of multiple laptop screens. He'd been attempting to delete files, running data destruction software, trying to erase the evidence before they arrived. But he hadn't moved fast enough. What they found in that apartment provided the final pieces of the puzzle. 27 laptops and tablets, each one containing data harvested from victims' phones and computers. Banking records, email archives, personal photos. Everything a predator would need to understand someone's life well enough to impersonate them digitally. 47 burner phones, each one used for a specific online identity, each one about to be destroyed but still intact when the FBI arrived. $890,000 in cash, stored in vacuum-sealed bags inside the walls of his apartment. Money he hadn't bothered to spend because spending it might draw attention. And trophies. That's what the forensic psychologists called them later. Photos of the victims taken during their dates, moments before the drugs took full effect, images capturing their smiles and hopes, and the last seconds before they realized something was wrong. Brandon had organized the photos in folders on his computer, labeled with first names and dates. Natalie's folder contained 43 photos from the night of June 17, 2017. She'd been smiling in the early ones. The photos had metadata, timestamps, GPS coordinates. They'd been taken at Josephine House, at the table where surveillance cameras showed her waiting alone. Blake had been there. He'd been watching. He'd probably been sitting at a nearby table or at the bar, close enough to take photos with his phone, close enough to watch her check her messages wondering why he was late. And then he'd approached her, probably apologizing for the delay, probably suggesting they move to a quieter place for better conversation. She'd followed him because she'd trusted him, because 3 weeks of messages had built a connection her loneliness made real. Brandon didn't resist arrest. He stood up from his desk slowly, hands visible, movements careful, and said, "I was expecting you." He didn't ask for a lawyer during the initial questioning, which surprised the agents who dealt with enough career criminals to know that guilty people usually ask for representation immediately. Brandon seemed to want to talk. Maybe he'd been alone with his secret for so long that having someone finally understand what he'd accomplished felt like relief. The interview room recording captured 5 hours of confession, delivered in a calm, steady voice that never wavered into emotion. He detailed his methods with the precision of someone describing a technical process, which in his mind it was. The selection criteria, the grooming period, the drug doses calculated by body weight, the time windows needed to access financial accounts before security systems locked them down, the burial procedures designed to slow decomposition. He remembered every victim by name. He remembered their professions, their children, the things they'd told him about their lives in those final messages. And when Agent Marsh asked him why he'd done this to 13 women who'd never hurt him, Brandon's answer was simple and monstrous. "They never suffered," he said. "I made sure of that. The drug kept them from being afraid. They didn't know what was happening. I'm not a monster. I'm not like those people who torture or rape or make it last. It was just business. They had money they'd never miss, and I needed it more than their families did." The logic was psychopathic in its clarity. He'd rationalized 13 murders as a form of wealth redistribution, himself as the beneficiary of a system that concentrates money in the hands of people too successful to notice when some of it disappears. Brandon Mitchell's trial began in June of 2025, 14 months after his arrest, and lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: DNA matches, financial records, digital forensics, the photos found on his computers. His own confession played in court, his voice calm and emotionless as he described calculating drug doses and burial depths. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity, bringing in psychiatrists who diagnosed antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic traits, and inability to process empathy the way neurotypical people do. But juries don't care about brain chemistry when they're looking at photos of 13 women who smiled at cameras hours before they died. The verdict came back guilty on all counts. 13 counts of first-degree murder. 13 counts of kidnapping. Multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, money laundering. The judge sentenced him to death by lethal injection, 13 death sentences to be carried out consecutively. A legal impossibility, but a symbolic gesture that mattered to the families watching from the gallery. Brandon showed no reaction when the sentence was read. He'd expected it. He'd probably known since the moment FBI agents broke down his door that his life was over. Elena organized Natalie's funeral for August 15, 2025, 8 years and 2 months after her sister disappeared. The service was held at a small chapel in Westlake, the same neighborhood where Natalie had lived her successful, lonely life. Sophie attended, 14 years old now, wearing a black dress that her stepmother had helped her pick out. The girl sat between Marcus and his wife, her face blank in that way teenagers have when they're feeling too much to show anything. Elena watched her niece and saw a stranger, a young woman who'd grown up without her mother, who'd learned to accept that absence as normal. After the service, Sophie approached Elena, and they stood together in awkward silence until the girl said quietly, "I don't remember her. I wish I did, but I don't. Is that terrible?" Elena shook her head, throat tight. "No," she managed. "You were 6. You weren't supposed to have to remember her this way." They buried Natalie's remains in a cemetery overlooking the hill country, under a live oak tree, with a headstone that listed her birth and death dates, with 7 years of nothing in between. Marcus paid for the funeral. It was the least he could do, though everyone including Marcus knew it would never be enough. The guilt of that casual conversation at a family barbecue, that offhand mention of his ex-wife's money to a cousin he barely knew, would follow him for the rest of his life. The FBI recovered $18.7 million of the $42.3 million Brandon had stolen, tracing funds through frozen accounts and seized assets. The remaining $23.6 million had been spent or hidden so well that even federal prosecutors with international cooperation couldn't find it. The families of the 13 victims received partial restitution, divided proportionally based on what had been taken from each woman. Natalie's share went into Sophie's trust fund. It wasn't justice, but it was something tangible, a number that represented value if not closure. Ivy donated $2 million from the sale of the company to a victim advocacy fund, trying to balance whatever guilt she carried about those emails she'd written, those thoughts about removing Natalie from the business. Some things don't balance, but people try anyway. December 9, 2025. Elena was at home in Houston, finally allowing herself to believe the case was closed, when an envelope arrived in her mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, color printed on standard paper. It showed a woman, mid-30s, professional, sitting alone at a restaurant table. The photo had been taken from across the room. Telephoto lens, the kind of surveillance shot that makes the subject unaware they're being watched. The woman was checking her phone, smiling at something on the screen. On the back of the photo, written in black marker, was a name, Blake. And below the name, a symbol that Elena recognized immediately because she'd seen it in Brandon's journals. A small geometric design he'd used to mark successful operations, a spiral moving outward from a center point, the same pattern his victims had been buried in. Elena's hands shook as she called Agent Marsh. The photo was analyzed for fingerprints, trace evidence, paper composition. Nothing useful. The image metadata showed it had been taken 3 weeks earlier at a restaurant in Fort Worth. The FBI contacted the restaurant, pulled security footage, identified the woman. Her name was Melissa. She was 36, divorced, worked as a financial analyst. And when agents interviewed her, she admitted she'd been talking to someone named Blake on a dating app for 2 weeks. They'd planned to meet in person next Friday. Brandon Mitchell was in a maximum security prison, on death row, with no access to phones or internet, or any way to create dating profiles or contact potential victims, which meant either someone had stolen his methods and his symbols, a copycat who knew details that had never been released to the public, or the truth was worse. Elena stood in the FBI command center looking at that wall that had never been taken down, 47 profiles, 13 identified victims, and saw what she should have seen earlier. The pattern within the pattern. 47 profiles over 8 years meant Brandon was creating a new identity every 7 weeks on average. But the timeline showed gaps, stretches where no new profiles appeared for months, and then clusters where multiple accounts were active simultaneously in different cities. One person couldn't be in Houston and Dallas and San Antonio at the same time, maintaining conversations with multiple targets, executing dates on the same weekends. The data had been telling them all along. Brandon Mitchell hadn't been working alone. He'd had a partner. Someone who shared his methods, his targeting criteria, his burial ground. Someone who'd stopped hunting when Brandon was arrested, staying quiet during the investigation and trial. And now, 18 months later, with Brandon safely on death row and the FBI declaring victory, that second person had started again. The hunt had never ended. It had just paused.